let's get into it, because I've really enjoyed our conversation a couple of weeks ago leading into this, and talking about something that's relevant to absolutely everyone here, and that's, how can you get your clients to work with you? And it's that old adage of, that scenario you may have where, this client just doesn't get what we're trying to do, and vice versa. And it's really addressing that challenge. So in your experience, let's first address that challenge that you found. Let's look at some examples that you've experienced. That, what is that main challenge of getting your client to work with you in that respect?
Okay. So as you said in the introduction when you first spoke at the beginning of today's session, my background was in a lot of the kind of big global agency networks, and I did that for around 20 years across 3 main agencies. And it didn't matter which part of the sort of broader marketing ecosystem I was working in. There was always one consistent point, and that was the relationship between an agency and a client. No matter how much the agency might talk about working in partnership, working as an extension of the client's team, there is always something that is fundamentally adversary in that relationship if it's not managed correctly. And by managed correctly, I don't mean the role that the account managers and account directors play. I mean in the effort it takes to really understand where a client's coming from. And one of the things that's a basic human truth that I've encountered time and time again is when people don't understand something, or when they're struggling to articulate something, they get frustrated. And those frustrations can often be taken out on the people that are closest to them. So you often find a relationship between any agency of any size and a client can quickly become fractious if there's a lack of understanding between the two parties. And I think one of the things that I also used to notice, because when I started out, I was a creative, so I started out as a copywriter and quickly progressed up until I was a joint creative lead in my agency. And I didn't fit into the traditional creative role because the majority of the creatives that I worked with didn't really want any face time with the client. Their view was the clients were all idiots, and the clients, when asked, would probably say that the creatives were all pretentious, frustrated artists. Neither of those things is true, but it's very easy to perpetuate those preconceptions. Whereas my role because I was a copywriter, mine was to understand the language, was to understand the message and the narrative that we needed to get across. I could often detect a frustration on the part of the clients in them trying to say what they wanted. And the number of times I'd receive a brief that would say something like, we just want something wow, or we want something that's never been done before. And to me, that's always a red flag that somebody is really struggling to articulate what they really want. So they're falling back on safe words that are easy to put out. But from the agency's perspective, it's super frustrating. Well, what does any of this mean? And I used to spend more time working directly with the clients, helping them take a step back from the briefing process and think about what they really wanted to do. And it was through spending a couple of years doing that that I then moved into a strategic lead role, where again, I then removed any responsibility for the end messaging, and I was much more responsible for helping the clients formulate and shape their thinking so that they knew what they wanted to tell any of the creative or agency partners that they were going to work with. Because on big projects, certainly in the last couple of agencies that I worked with, you were actually part of a much wider team of agencies. Some might be from your network and others not. So there was automatically a sort of territorial sense of competition. But you could have a PR agency, a digital agency, a social media agency, the sort of production company, a logistics company, an on-the-ground team. And all of those guys had to learn to play nicely because the client didn't really care who was doing what. They just wanted the job done well. And so any opportunity to share understanding, to recognize that we can all work on something together in a collaborative way and just make the client's life easier. Because any agency, it doesn't matter what you deliver and it doesn't matter what your creative outputs are. Your job as an agency is one thing and one thing only, and that's to help your client either grow their business or get their next promotion. That's why all agencies exist. And so you forget that fundamental rule at your peril. So my role has always been thinking about how to help the clients communicate more effectively, not in terms of the output that they want to deliver to market, but even to the various agency professionals that they're dealing with day to day. And that's been a kind of a driving principle for me pretty much throughout my whole career.
Yeah, and I mean, the attendees that we've got today, they're all part of the marketing, the digital, the creative ecosystem. So they're all part of that food chain, as it were, and they all have their respective clients. And really, what we're talking about is that initial consultation, that initial meeting to set the precedents and really articulate how things are going to pan out, and that really makes the difference between a happy and an unhappy client down the road. Because you were talking before we spoke today is about the what you don't want is, as an agency, and I'm sure there's lots in here that can relate, is down the line you're having that conversation and you're going, they just don't understand, or they're just not understanding. So what can people do, or what have you seen that can be done effectively at the outset to really set those principles in place?
It's a great question. I think one of the most important things, and it's not any one tactic that you can deploy, it's more a fundamental approach that you need to keep coming back to time and time again. And for me, it's all about establishing a shared language and a shared understanding of what we're doing. And I use an example all the time. You mentioned in the introduction to think about examples of things that have happened during my career. And I have one incident that is such a powerful example of what happens if you don't clarify your terminology. Because and just the people that I met in the networking session before we began today's conversation, there's clearly an awful lot of experience and expertise gathered around those tables in today's meetup. And so when you have a lot of expertise, it's very easy to be tempted to sort of take shortcuts or assume knowledge on the part of the people that you're dealing with. So this example of something that happened, the short version is, we were working with a digital agency in Australia to deliver a website for a campaign that we were doing in the UK for a wine brand. And there'd been some tension between the teams because we hadn't selected this agency. They'd been allocated for us by the client, and we just had to work with them. And of course, a 12-hour time difference means someone's always unhappy on that call because they're either up super early or up super late, and so no one's ever completely happy. But the relationship started to become difficult because they weren't getting what we wanted, and I could see they weren't getting what we wanted because our project lead wasn't articulating what they wanted. And at one point, they came back with a third iteration of their design and build. And the project lead got really frustrated. And she said, do you know what? You've made this far too complicated. This was supposed to be a simple site. We just wanted consumers to be able to log on, read the blog, look at the pictures, and find out where the roadshow was going next. And the agency threw everything up in the air. And they just said, oh, my God, we've got to go back to square one. And the project lead said, well, why do we have to do that? And they said, well, we didn't know that we needed password authentication and login details and, effectively to create a membership profile for each visitor to the site. The project lead said, where did you get that idea from? And it was simply because she'd used the word login. What she meant by login was what first generation internet users meant, which was the act of going to a site we used to call logging in or logging on. It just meant to be on the web. But to digital natives, to specialists who work in the digital space, if you talk about logging on, it means you've got a protected site that people have to have authenticated details in order to access. That simply, almost casual use of the word log on or log in created a whole range of problems simply because we hadn't almost agreed a glossary of terms or a framework of language where we had a shared understanding. And I think what we all have to do when working with a new client is, before we start taking on board the information of their request of us, we have to test their understanding of the world we're operating in together. So the briefing it's interesting, when you work in an agency, no one ever really teaches you how to write a brief. And consequently, for clients, no one ever teaches them how to write a brief either. And the problem is, we talk about writing a brief. A brief is not a written document. That's a briefing form. The brief is a physical act. It's an actual conversation that takes place between two people, two professionals, two businesses. And it's about establishing a shared understanding. And it's a two-way conversation as well. So it's not something that the agency has to sit and passively receive as somebody starts talking. It's a conversation. So it's taking the opportunity to shape your own understanding as the client, imparting, their vision, their ambition, their goal, their scope, their budget, all of that stuff. It's all the information that you can supplement onto it, rather than expecting the client to present you with a written down wish list of things that they want.
And a lot that you guys talk about inside stories is telling that story, whether that's in a pitch format, whether that's generally telling stories about businesses or in briefs in general. So how can people here help their own clients? So because this is something that can be remedied down the line as in that client journey, not just at the outset, but what's something that people can do to start taking those first steps that you think to help their clients work with them better, and vice versa? As you say, it's a two-way relationship, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think that, that two-way relationship, the most fundamental point of all of it is, I think we all need to get better at listening. When we establish ourselves as professionals, as experts, particularly when we found our own businesses, we kind of wear that expertise like a badge of honor. And sometimes we can go into conversations and seeing them as a conversation is just waiting for your opportunity to speak so you can show off how much you know. And sometimes there's an eagerness to demonstrate that capability, that expertise, that tramples over the client's need to be heard and understood. So we spend a lot of time, and our whole business model has been built around active listening, innovative ways of questioning and teasing out the information that we need to get. And I think the other thing as well, and again, it came up in the conversation in the networking this morning that I was really pleased about is, we had a copywriter, we had a film and video agency, we had a digital specialist, we had a social media specialist, and none of us were seeing each other as competition. We were recognizing that every marketing journey for every client is a continuum, and there are different opportunities for you to deliver your best work along that continuum. And I think it behooves all of us to find our place in that journey, rather than trying to almost strong arm our way into a part that doesn't necessarily speak to our core capabilities, because we all have to present ourselves as knowing a little bit of everything. But consequently, for clients, it makes it harder to them actually recognize where your differentiated skill set is. But I think that structured conversations that aren't geared towards a physical deliverable, but are more broadly around building up an understanding of the client. And I was thrown by the dog barking, because I have two dogs as well. And they don't sound quite as big as that. It's again, I think one of the things that we've sometimes encountered when we talk to our clients about where they've perhaps been frustrated or missold something as a solution is where the end product becomes the purpose of the relationship. And I think any marketing professional, it doesn't matter whether you're digital or PR or social or blogging or a copywriter, to enter that conversation with a view to what are the elements, what are the assets that I can charge the client for, is coming at it from the wrong angle. Because what we find is the client's needs grow organically out of feeling that they've got an empathetic relationship, that they're heard and understood by whoever the agency is that they're working with. And then that way, the work logically finds its way to the people who can do it best.
Yeah, and you mentioned there about teasing questions out of clients, and I think that's definitely an important process. And what have you seen? What are the right questions that people can use to get out that best information? Can you share any examples of what that you've used perhaps in the past that have brought some good results?
Well, I definitely try, and so one of the big shifts that I experienced during my career, when I started out in my career 100,000 years ago, we all learned about the USP, and the USP was sacrosanct in marketing terms. The idea that you have to get to the heart of each client's unique selling point. But the problem is that as a premise was established in the 1950s, you know, when someone would literally deliver a new product that had never been seen before. So the idea of the USP was quite easy to glom onto. In the 2020s, the idea of something being fundamentally unique just doesn't work. It's not a real thing. So what we try and think about much more, because it really does help change the tenor of the conversation, is the idea of an emotional selling point. Because once you start engaging emotionally, not just with the client, but encouraging the client to think in emotional terms about the relationship that they want to have with their consumers. And it doesn't matter whether that's a B2B or a B2C, every client is geared around the need for a relationship with the consumer. And those relationships are founded on emotional principles. So spending some time thinking about what the emotions are that you want to trigger in the people that you're looking to reach is a really important one. And, you know, what I find is when you're having those conversations with a client, like I said, the brief is a conversation, it's not a physical thing. Sometimes you need to give clients permission to speak in emotional terms. And I'll sometimes experience it where clients almost wear business language like a suit of armor, you know, and they use those sort of glib terms like it's not personal, it's business. Well, business is personal, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or horribly mistaken. And I think if you can encourage people to step outside of their kind of slightly formal, slightly awkward business language and actually communicate person to person, to communicate on an emotional, empathetic level, they'll start to give themselves permission to have more emotional conversations about the relationship that they want to establish with their customer. So if you think about it in networking terms, someone who approaches networking as the moment there's 5 seconds of dead air, they can launch into their business pitch. That's old school marketing. The more effective way of working and the way that actually builds that empathy that is the foundation for all good relationships is going in and listening, is not needing to be the first one to speak, is not needing to be the one who's taken up the most airtime, is what can I learn about these people? How can I ask questions that show not only that I'm interested in them, but I'm thinking about what they've told me, and I'm asking a follow-up question that shows I've really considered what they've already shared, and I'm already taking my thought process down maybe an unforeseen avenue, because there they can see that the process has already happened. We're not just there on an information gathering thing and then we go away and secret squirrel it and do it behind a protective arm like it's homework to be kept secret. That's the opportunity, is inviting the client into the process itself so they can see where the ideas come from. Where are the stimulating points? What have you heard as an agency professional that the client said where you're going, that's a golden nugget, I can use that? Because they ultimately want to see their DNA in the end product. Whatever it is you make for a client, you write blogs, you run their social media account, you're delivering their PR campaign, you're doing advertising, you're revamping their website. They need to see themselves in the end result. And the only way you can do that is by making sure that they feel like full participants in the process.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, back to your point about listening and genuinely taking interest. And we make a point a lot about the most effective person in a networking scenario, and it's the same in a client-facing scenario, is the most curious person. It's not the best connected, it's not the richest person. The most curious person will reap the rewards and reap the benefits from those conversations. leading on to where inside stories play a part in that, and really talking about, you know, what the impact that you are trying to have and the problems that you are trying to overcome. Just give some insight into how your approach, and you and Terry, who's with us today within the event, what's the inside stories approach, and what impact are you trying to make within that ecosystem, as I referenced earlier?
So thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. I think what we're ultimately trying to do is service what we see as largely an unmet need. So one of the things that we quickly learned, particularly by talking to clients and prospects, and also other people who initially perceived us as competition in the space, was that adversarial relationship between client and agency that we talked about at the start is not unique to big agencies. It can also happen in small agencies. And what we discovered quite quickly, well, I discovered firsthand about 5 years ago when I left big agency world and started working directly with clients, and they'd often tell me about bad experiences that they'd had, is because of all this stuff we've talked about today about ineffective communication, or, you know, lack of empathetic understanding at the point of briefing and turning the brief into a constructive conversation. What happens is that there's kind of two streams where, on the one hand, the client feels exhausted because they've never worked with an agency before. They've never been in that position to procure those kinds of services. So they don't know what good looks like, and they can be easily swayed by slick sales talk. Conversely, the agency has a margin to make, and the way they make the margin is by getting the work done as quickly as they can to make sure that their costs are covered, their overheads are covered, and anything else besides is money in the pot. So they have a job to do using economies of scale. But to the client who's never bought marketing services before, the first pound they spend is a pound they've never spent before. So everything feels expensive. If the briefing process isn't effective, particularly if the briefing process is being led by people who haven't been responsible for taking briefs before, the communication process breaks down. The work that gets presented back isn't right. The client is frustrated that the work isn't what they'd envisaged when they'd had the conversation. The agency then says, well, we'll have to do it again, and it's going to cost you again. And before you know it, there's already this breakdown in relationship. That doesn't lead to long-term work. That doesn't lead to contracts and commitment. That's just, look, let's just get this project done and, you know, draw a line under it. So what we recognized in that is that our role was not to be in competition with established marketing, digital, design, branding agencies. It was to supplement what those businesses do in a way that didn't tread on their toes, but it almost got the client ready to work with those kinds of businesses, so that every penny they spend with those businesses is money well spent, because it's geared around a well-articulated brief, a really clear sense of vision, mission, purpose, all of those things that are the beating heart of the business that the business owners often really struggle to articulate. They know why they're doing what they're doing because they hear that drumbeat internally, but God knows they struggle to articulate that to anybody else, and that gets them frustrated. So our role is to work directly with the clients to help them figure out where they're going, how they plan to get there, what happens if they're looking to secure new investment, what happens if they're looking to bring on board new capabilities or specialisms in terms of the enhanced team as they grow and develop, if they're looking to launch new products or brands or services sitting under their umbrella, how do they ensure that the new streams that they pursue are consistent with the overall purpose and agenda of the brand that they've created? The storytelling act, the thing that we create with them, underpins all of those things. And so that means then if they want to speak to a writer who's going to generate blogs from them, the blog comes from a point of view that they've articulated as a business. So it's easier for the writer to get it right first time because they understand the voice that they're trying to articulate. If it's a social media account, we've already codified what the behaviors of that brand are, so we know how that brand should operate in the social media space. Is it about conversations? Is it about humor? Is it about engagement? Or is it about sales messages? It could be any or all of those things. Likewise, if you're going to a PR specialist, what PR agencies need is stories. They don't want just detail. They need a hook that they can sell on to a journalist. So again, what the story does is it goes, here's where we're going with this. This is the reason behind all of this activity. So again, it helps the agency do their best possible work. And through that, we've found that the clients we've worked with, they leave our process effectively with a storybook that they can use to as a foundational document for any briefing process with any marketing or comms specialist. And the marketing and comms specialists see this output and they go, this has just made our lives so much easier. But we know as a small agency, we don't have this capability in-house. We don't have the communication strategist with 15, 20 years experience to tease out this kind of information. So that's where we can help.
Yeah, fantastic. And I will end on a question that's come in the Q&A area, and just talk about what you're seeing out there, and some examples of companies that you think use emotion really well in their branding, marketing, and even their storytelling. So who do you look at and go, they're doing it really well?
Well, it's really interesting at the moment because I think particularly during the last 3 months and the lockdown, we've seen a lot of brands that aren't necessarily particularly emotional try and forge a new kind of empathy. They've been putting their employees front and center because, you know, they can't hire actors, they can't go and do film shoots. So, you know, all the supermarket brands, you know, the Co-op's done it, Tesco's done it, Sainsbury's have done it. They've all tried to demonstrate an emotional empathy for what ordinary people are going through. All the banks are doing it. And so if we'd had this conversation 12 months ago, I might have talked about, you know, the big brands that Coca-Cola, for instance, their whole premise is about happiness. They don't talk about making a sugary brown beverage. They talk about happiness. Their whole proposition is rooted in an emotion rather than the actual product or what it is that they bring to market. You know, Apple are always a great brand because they talk about thinking differently by inspiring people to own their own engagement with the products that they make. But as I said, I think what's been really interesting in the last 3 months is there's been a bit of a leveling of the playing field. More people have recognized the need for empathy when communicating with customers, going, you're experiencing a shitty time at the moment. This is horrible for all of us, but we're all pulling together and doing it. And I think it's, you know, it sometimes gets a little bit tiresome. If I never have to see one more ad shot in portrait format on an iPhone, I'll be very happy. But I do feel like the brands are putting personality and emotion ahead of, you know, generic brand messaging. So, I mean, that's my initial answer to that one. I see there's another question as well about seeing how the public or potential clients feel about their brand. I think that's a really smart question, and it's a really great tactic. Obviously, when you're dealing with SMEs, particularly people who are new to market, there isn't a lot of public perception out there. So there isn't really any data that you can go to find those kinds of insights. But one of the things that I've always encouraged clients to do in terms of understanding themselves better is I ask them about the good and bad feedback that they get. And, you know, it's always a red flag for me if they get defensive when they talk about the negative feedback that they've got, you know, because again, those people are idiots, or these people have got a vendetta, or they're probably affiliated with the competition. It's very easy to pull the wool over your own eyes when you're faced with some, you know, confrontational feedback. But I think, you know, there is always information out there about what people think of the product or service that you offer. And even we, as Inside Stories, you know, we take the feedback that we get very seriously because, you know, we're constantly evolving. We're constantly learning about what people like or enjoy or feel challenged by in the experience of working with us. That doesn't necessarily mean we'll change and adapt in accordance with every piece of feedback we get. But again, for me, empathy is not trying to be all things to all people, but it's understanding that different people will have different reactions to you and how you present yourself. But I do think definitely opportunity to look at how you're perceived. One of the things I used to do back when I worked as a strategist in a big agency was I would do research, and I would literally Google "I love" and "I hate" for the brand that I was working on, and you'll quickly fall down a rabbit hole of horrible internet chat forums, but you'll find the unexpurgated truth of what people really think about those brands and businesses, and it'll give you really compelling, unpolished feedback on those brands. And I've often used some of that really confrontational, off the record feedback. I've used that directly with clients, and I've said, look, you might polish the feedback that you share with us and go, well, generally 98% of customers are really happy with our brand, product, or service. Whereas I'll go, well, this is what people are really saying about you. And that can be challenging for clients to hear.
Yeah, and that's something that people could do, not specifically for their own brand, but their sector in general. You could Google what people love and what people hate, and as you say, find yourself down a rabbit hole and really see what people's pain points and what people enjoy about that as a sector and as part of that ecosystem. So definitely can see some value in that. Look, Gareth, we're going to have to end it there. Really, really appreciate your time for joining us today, and thank you for bearing with us and being helpful in overcoming some of our technical difficulties. But I'm delighted that we've managed to get 25-30 minutes conversation in, and I hope that people here have found some value in that. And I know that you'll be in the room for the next half an hour or so, however long, until the event rounds up. But